So welcome. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Ann Galloway, who is the founder of BT Digger and our current editor-in-chief.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Stacy Mitchell is co-director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which produces research and analysis to provide innovative strategies to support sustainable local economies. If you heard her on Vermont Edition yesterday, she talked a lot about downtown revitalization as part of the independent business communities and how that drives people to come together. She's the author of Big Box Swindle, which is right here. I'm sure there are copies here in the store that you could purchase. And has produced several influential reports, including Monopoly Power and the Decline of Small Business. She's also given a TED Talk about the consolidation of the banking industry, which is also fascinating. So without further ado, Stacy's going to speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll ask her a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience a little bit.
Great, thank you. It's terrific to be here. Let's see. And great to see all of you. I really appreciate you coming out tonight. Much of our research, I've been with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance for about 20 years, and in that time looking a lot at local economies and particularly at the retail sector, because local businesses are so much of a part of the health of our communities, the well-being of our local economies. And the biggest issue in the retail sector right now is the rise of Amazon and the growth that Amazon is having and the power that it increasingly has in the marketplace. And so what I wanted to do in about 10 or 15 minutes is just orient you a little bit to some of our research and thinking about Amazon, and then I think in the course of the questions with Ann and with all of you, we'll then open it up into sort of broader ways that connects with other issues. Amazon is in many ways very familiar to all of us. You know, it is the package that shows up on the doorstep. It is the site that seems to sell everything with one-click efficiency. If you're among the millions of households that now have an Echo speaker in your house installed, ordering from Amazon is even easier than one click. It's as easy as a passing thought that you utter to a speaker as you walk by. But as familiar as Amazon seems to be, it's also largely invisible. It's as though we're seeing this small part of Amazon that rises above the surface that we interact with. We see the package on the door, but we don't really see the mechanics behind it. And we don't see everything that's below the surface. And there's a huge part of it that's below the surface that extends in all of these different directions. And it wouldn't be an understatement that Amazon is really in the process of reorganizing our economy in fundamental ways, the ways that commerce happens. And those changes have far-reaching implications for all of us and for our local communities. So one of the mistakes that people make about Amazon, or that we all make about Amazon, is that we tend to think of Amazon as a retailer. It's understandable. Amazon now captures nearly 1 out of every $2 that Americans spend online. Amazon sells more books, toys, consumer electronics, and clothing than any other retailer online or off. It's making big investments in the grocery sector, just bought Whole Foods, for example. It is, a major retailer. But to think of Amazon as a retailer is to really misunderstand what this company is all about. And when I say that, I don't just mean that there are all these other things that Amazon does besides sell stuff, but it certainly does a lot of things besides sell stuff. It produces hit television shows and movies. It publishes a lot of books. It manufactures a growing share of what it sells on its website, from batteries to baby wipes to blouses. It has more than half a dozen apparel lines and makes almost 2,000 items of clothing, different items of men, women's, and children's clothing, all under different labels. In big cities, it delivers restaurant orders, it underwrites loans, it sells advertising. It manages the data of U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA. Amazon is one of the largest defense contractors. Amazon, you may have heard recently, is in the process of moving into the pharmacy sector with the intent, it appears, of not only distributing prescription drugs, but becoming a pharmacy benefit manager and therefore interfacing with our health insurance companies to decide the terms of our pharmacy benefits. So I could go on. These are just a taste of the sort of far-reaching things that Amazon does besides sell stuff. But when I say that it's a mistake to think of Amazon as a retailer, it's not just that the company is engaged in all these other areas. It's that the role that Amazon aims to play in our economy is much deeper and much more fundamental than all of these other industries combined. Amazon intends to control the underlying infrastructure of 21st century commerce. And there are three pieces to that. One is that it has become the dominant online platform for buying and selling goods. And the key statistic to understanding that is that 55% of all online shopping searches, so 55% of people when they go to buy something online, they start at Amazon. Used to be, even just 2 or 3 years ago, that most people started at a search engine. Said, oh, I want to find this particular toy or that kind of running shoe or whatever it may be. They'd get a list of different retailers. Amazon would, of course, be among that list, but they would see other options. Now people just start right on Amazon. How Amazon has managed to do that, the key to that is Prime membership. You know, they have this annual program. You pay $99 a year. You get 2-day free shipping and streaming television and a host of other perks. How many folks are Prime members? Yeah. It's over half of all households in the US are now Prime members. And the thing with Prime is that the point of getting you to pay the $99 is not about the fee. Amazon actually loses money on the free shipping. The fee doesn't cover the cost. The point of getting you to pay the $99 is that once you've paid it, you naturally want to maximize the value that you get from it. It's a little behavioral economics trick. And so people want to get more free shipping. They want to get as much free shipping out of that $99 as they can. And so what studies show is that people who are Prime members, they stop comparison shopping. They just start on Amazon. They make assumptions that it has low prices. That may or may not be the case, and so on. So the effect of this, getting back to controlling the underlying infrastructure of the economy, the effect of the fact that consumers are by and large just starting at Amazon now, what that means is that all of these competing retailers, both small retailers and big chains, manufacturers, both small and large companies, businesses that used to have their own website and maybe still do, it is as though their website is sitting out there and they're now on a dirt road where there's just a few people walking by, right? And they face this sort of Faustian choice. Do I become a seller on Amazon's platform? Do I become that marketplace seller? You know, you see that, these other sellers that sell this, because that's where all the traffic is. But once I do that, I have become utterly dependent on my most ferocious competitor. Lots of manufacturers, small and large, and many retailers have made that choice, and there are problems with that we'll talk about. The second piece of the infrastructure of commerce that Amazon controls is through its Amazon Web Services, which is the cloud computing part of Amazon. Amazon controls 44% of the global cloud computing capacity. You know, companies, intelligence agencies, everybody keeping their data in the cloud now, managing and manipulating their data in the cloud. So lots of Amazon's competitors, including Netflix, Comcast, Nordstrom, they actually pay Amazon to use its cloud services. So again, they are dependent on Amazon for their access to the market and their ability to compete. And then the third piece of the infrastructure that Amazon is after has to do with shipping and package delivery. Amazon is building out warehouses at a lightning speed. They're building these sortation centers and these hubs in cities. And they're handling more and more of their own packages, including that very final mile. And instead of using the Postal Service and UPS, they're increasingly displacing those companies, and they're using a combination of what they call Amazon Flex drivers, which are like Uber drivers. You know, you have an app and you're paid, you get a certain load of packages, and it's like a piece rate system. You're paid for those packages, not an hourly. You're an so-called independent contractor, and you go out and deliver packages. They're also using third-party couriers, which are these kind of small companies that frankly have a history of labor violations that also subcontract with their workers. Amazon, according to analysts, they are really looking to grow to the point where they're not only delivering their own packages, but they're delivering packages for other companies, and they're increasingly displacing UPS and the Postal Service. So now you begin to think about it. You're a producer of some innovative product. Well, if you want to reach the market, you've got to be on Amazon's platform. If you want your goods to get to the doorstep in the time that consumers expect, you've got to use its shipping service. If you need any cloud and data services to run your company, you're going to be using Amazon. And you can begin to see the kind of power that this one company is amassing. So what this means is that Amazon is sort of, it controls the pipes or the rails, if you will, that other companies need to get to market. And this is a very lucrative position to be in, because Amazon can say, well, here are the products and services that we think are most lucrative, and we'll do those ourselves. We'll manufacture clothes, we'll do the other things that we choose to do. And we have the power to shut out our competitors in those areas and just take that market. And then for the other stuff that isn't lucrative or we don't want to deal with, we'll let other companies ride our rails, and we'll charge them a fee to do that. So we'll essentially tax the rest of everybody else's commerce. So the result of this is that Amazon has a business model that has concentrated a lot of power. Scott Galloway, who is a professor at NYU and a consultant to many companies and is a astute critic of Amazon, has said that Amazon will be the first company on the stock market to get to $1 trillion market capitalization. He says at that point we will break it up, so that may be the good news. There's a very prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalist who last year gave a presentation in which he described Amazon as a, quote, multi-trillion-dollar monopoly hiding in plain sight. So the word monopoly is really important here. It seems like a word that's like, it's a kind of old word. Seems like it's from another time, right? Because we've kind of been ignoring our antitrust policies for the last 35 years or so. As some of you may know, there was a kind of intellectual revolution among the law and economics fields in the 1970s. And it sort of swept into power with Reagan, also supported by a lot of prominent Democrats at the time. And they didn't get rid of the antitrust laws, but they rewrote how they're enforced, with the effect that they're really not particularly well enforced. They are very narrow now, whereas they used to be broad and more inclusive of a range of issues. So one of the consequences of that is that Amazon has been able to grow to this position using tactics that a couple of generations ago would not have been allowed. But Amazon has been able to do that. I could give you a number of examples, but I'll just give you a couple to give you a flavor of what I'm talking about. So one is that Amazon often sells entire categories of goods below cost. It has done this with books. It did this with books a lot in its early years. And the consequence is that if you're a competing bookstore that has to pay your bills at the end of the month, you can't match Amazon on price, and it can just lose money because its investors will back it. So in its first 6 years of business, Amazon lost $3 billion. Its investors barely blinked an eye because they're counting on long-term monopoly. They're willing to lose money now for market share later. And the result was predictable. Lots of bookstores closed, and today Amazon sells about half of all books, print and digital. There are other examples, the way Amazon responds to upstart competitors. How many of you are familiar with Zappos, the shoe retailing site? So Zappos came along, and they had a different way of doing things, and they attracted quite a customer following, and Amazon went to them, Jeff Bezos went to them and said, we'd like to buy you. And they said, no, we're going to do our own thing. So Amazon then sold shoes at a loss online, free shipping and at a loss. And Zappos, in order to keep customers, had to match this. They started bleeding money. And then the financial crisis came along and their board said, we can't do this. And they sold to Amazon. So Zappos is now owned by Amazon. It's one of many kind of online brands that they have bought up. So there's no competition. They can foreclose competition before it even really gets going. And then a final example of this is sort of how Amazon deals with its third-party sellers. So I mentioned earlier that lots of manufacturers, and these are big brands like Levi's and Nike and KitchenAid, are now sellers on Amazon's platform because they can't get enough traffic on their own websites. And many retailers, independents, and chains are as well. Amazon uses the information it gleans from those sellers to compete against them and to undermine them. There are lots of different ways that it does this, but I'll just give you one example, and this has been, there have been a lot of good reporting by Harvard Business Review, studies by ProPublica, Bloomberg. One of the studies that Bloomberg, or one of the examples that Bloomberg uncovered about a year ago was this company called Rain Design. Rain Design is a small business out in the Bay Area, and they make this kind of nifty laptop stand. It's like this sort of cool metal thing. They make various versions of them, and they had built up a business making this stand and selling it online. They sell through their own site and through other places, but because Amazon is the big pipeline of consumer traffic, most of their sales are on Amazon. And they've done very well there. They have thousands of 4- and 5-star reviews. They're top-rated products on Amazon. About a year ago, the founders woke up and discovered that they were no longer in those top search results on Amazon. The products that appeared there were products that looked exactly like their laptop stands, except instead of having their raindrop logo, it had the Amazon smile, right? I happened to look the other day, and Rain Design's laptop stands are now back up at the top of the search results. If you search for laptop stands, you'll see them. But I noticed that Rain Design is now a paying advertiser. You know that sponsored products thing that you'll see on an Amazon page? So they are now one of those, they're basically paying, in a sense, to be able to hold that placement. So Amazon's going to make money. They're going to extract value from every other business coming or going, whichever way they can. There are lots of examples of how they manipulate sellers on their platform, including abruptly suspending accounts and people finding that their business that they had built up is suddenly just gone overnight, and it's very difficult to get reinstated. Part of the reason that regulators haven't intervened in these situations is that Amazon's actions appear to benefit consumers, particularly through low prices, we assume. But we should be really skeptical of this, because we know that having one company be the gatekeeper for a lot of commerce is not going to serve us as consumers very well. And we also know that Amazon, when it comes to prices, Amazon has this huge information advantage over all of us because they collect so much data on us, and they collect all this data on all the transactions that go on. You hover your mouse over a certain thing, they know that. You click on this, you don't click on that. What you're doing on the web when you're not on Amazon, what you're streaming for their television services. If you have an Echo in your home, just imagine all that they pick up through the questions that you ask your Echo speaker or ask Alexa. So they make millions of price changes every day. There are these websites you can go and you can see like a particular product on Amazon. It looks like a stock market kind of ticker. It just up and down, up and down. Why is it higher at some points than lower? I mean, I don't really know, but is it that Amazon knows that if you're shopping at 11 o'clock at night, you're not very price sensitive? Is it they know something about people who live in different regions, that if you just looked at a certain kind of product that you're less price sensitive? I mean, who knows? But the information advantage is on their side, and so I think we should be very skeptical about the notion of low price, and certainly in an environment in which they become the dominant supplier of many things. The other thing that I think from a consumer perspective that is really quite, and an economic perspective that's really quite alarming about this, is that Amazon increasingly steers what products we see. You know, which books show up in the recommended books list? A lot of Amazon published titles, right? Which toys show up, which everything shows up. And you think when we did this report about Amazon late last year that I recommend. It's long, it's about 75 pages, but it's very readable and it's organized so you can kind of pick and choose what you like. But for me, one of the most powerful parts of that report is the interviews that we did with small and mid-sized manufacturers. We interviewed book publishers and clothing makers and toy makers, all these different companies. And they're like, it has become so much harder to introduce a new product because the way that a new product finds its way into the market is that local brick and mortar stores pick it up. They hand sell it to their consumers. It's a new toy. You go to the toy store, you get to play with it, and you're like, oh, this is really cool. And then you talk about it, and it goes from there. Maybe it eventually ends up in the big stores. That's the pathway that a lot of new products go through. It's true for books, too. If everyone's starting at Amazon, it's very difficult for new products to find their way in that environment. And that's scary enough in the context of innovative new toys that we don't even know didn't make it to market, you know. But it's very scary in the context of books and ideas and what that means to democracy and who succeeds and who doesn't. So it's also important that we, of course, remember that we're not just consumers and that our economic well-being depends on our ability to make a decent living. And that actually used to be part of antitrust law. Up until these changes in the 1980s, antitrust law looked at, you know, is consolidation hurting the ability of people to have a fair chance in the market to earn a decent living? Is it hurting and pushing down wages because there are not enough companies competing for workers that lift up wages? Is it blocking the ability of new businesses to start up? And new businesses are a pathway to the middle class. These are the kinds of things that antitrust regulators used to consider, and they threw all that out in the 1980s. But when we look at Amazon, we can see that its tightening grip on the economy is increasingly a driver of a lot of structural issues, including rising inequality. One way that it contributes to rising inequality is by squeezing out competing businesses. Over the last 10 years or so, we've had a net loss nationwide of about 108,000 independent retail businesses. We just did a national survey, and 90% of independent retailers say that Amazon is having a negative impact on their sales. They rate Amazon as a bigger concern than health insurance costs or big box retail or whatever it may be. And the effects on manufacturers, too. These small and mid-sized manufacturing companies, as I mentioned, are increasingly having a difficult time in this environment. They tell these beautiful stories to me about how much independent retailers matter to their success. There's like an ecology in these industries, and the diversity of different players matters to things being able to bubble up and new companies being able to get started, the dynamism of that. And of course, all of these things are middle-class job drivers. You know, starting a business is a tried and true method of getting into the middle class, or I shouldn't say tried and true, but it is a long-standing method of getting into the middle class. But we're increasingly seeing new business formation drop, you know, quite dramatically. A second way that Amazon is undermining our well-being is that it's pushing down wages. You know, 1 in 10 workers in this country is in retail. 1 out of every 10. Amazon requires about half as many workers to distribute the same amount of goods that traditional retailers require. So you can begin to do the math. You know, as dollars shift to Amazon, we've seen all these store closures in the news and so on. There are layoffs. The number of layoffs is about twice as many jobs lost as the number of new jobs in Amazon warehouses, if you just sort of look at the math of their basic labor efficiency, if you will. And this also has a geographic implication, all of these trends, because the warehouses that Amazon builds are only in select locations. There are none here in Vermont, for example. And many of the good-paying tech jobs that are associated with Amazon, or Google for that matter, they're just in a handful of big metro areas. Meanwhile, if you're in a second-tier city or a rural region or a small town, those places are losing their small businesses, their corporate headquarters. That stuff is disappearing. And we've got a few metros that are doing well and a lot of the country that is being left behind. This has political implications, right? And it has dimensions as well for living in places where we control our own future. You know, living in communities where we have a say, a way of steering what happens to our economies. You know, and as we lose local businesses, as we lose the face-to-face interactions that anchor our economic transactions, you know, we really lose those connections as community, that ability locally to solve problems and be part of a community that you know, has a way of determining its own future to a degree. Not that the economy has to be entirely local, but that there's something that anchors it. There's a set of resources and a capacity locally. That's very much related to democracy, liberty, equality, our ability, our freedom as a people to set our own direction. And indeed, all of these sort of connections that I've been making to these larger trends, there are now these economic studies that show, in fact, that regions that are more consolidated have a smaller middle class and more income inequality, that places that have lots of small businesses, community ties are stronger, there's more civic participation, people vote more often, and so on. So there's research that really backs up that all of this stuff actually matters. So I wanted, as I hope I've done, to alarm you to a degree, because I think that this is, I think that this is a very striking and shift that is underway with a company and with, as I said, very far-reaching implications, and has really, in a lot of ways, gone under the radar. I mean, when Walmart kind of marched across the country, and Walmart, I don't want to understate its power. It's 1/4 of our food system. 1/4 of our grocery dollars in this country go through Walmart. So, it is a huge problem. But, Amazon is sort of another level of this. And at least with Walmart, when they came into communities, or they proposed coming into communities, it was a front page news. And people debated it. People went to town council meetings, and there's planning law, and what do we do, and how do we think about this? None of that's happening with Amazon, and that's, I think, probably the scariest part of this whole story. But that said, there are lots of ways that I think we can begin to grapple with this, and there are growing numbers of people who are. And I think, as we go forward with questions and hear from you, we'll kind of drill further into these things. But I want to say a couple of things right off. One is that my argument is not an anti-technology argument. Digital innovation is a great thing. Being able to transact some commerce with our phones and our computers and all of that is welcome in a lot of ways and probably inevitable. But I think that we make a mistake if we forget what face-to-face interactions bring to our economy, and this chain of relationships that goes from customer to store owner to manufacturer to the region of the economy and so on. And that the question is, how do we anchor digital commerce in a political economy that values place, that values those human relationships, that values democracy? That is, how do we have all those things that are important to us and have the conveniences of technology? How do we preserve local businesses and still be able to buy from them online? And second, my argument is not so much about whether or not Amazon is an evil company. I mean, they may well be. But I don't think it's really, whatever. Whether Amazon has our best interests in mind or not is not particularly the issue. The argument we're making in our work is that Amazon's dominance, the control that it has, is largely a product of public policy. It's those changes in antitrust law, but there are also various ways, that we have really underwritten and supported Amazon's expansion, and we can talk more about the specifics of that, but we've tilted the playing field from a government standpoint and made it much harder for local and regional businesses to compete. So I think that there's lots that we can do as consumers in terms of our choices, in terms of the conversations that we have with other people, in terms of getting the word out, engaging people and thinking more deeply about what is going on out there, and also with our policymakers, with our local elected officials, the things that they need to be doing to build the kind of economy that is going to be resilient in the face of some of these things. And we're already seeing signs that independent retailers are, while deeply threatened in a lot of ways by Amazon, are more resilient than a lot of the chains are. And so this is something that local elected officials need to know, and they need to double down in investing in those local businesses. But I also think that we need to go big with a conversation with federal lawmakers in particular, and perhaps state attorney general about antitrust, about concentrated economic power and the threat that it really poses to our economic well-being and to our democracy. And the good news on that front is that there are growing numbers of economists, lawmakers in Congress, and organizations like mine and others that are talking a lot more about antitrust now, even than just a year ago. So there is a growing movement out there that I hope you all will get involved in. So thank you, and with that I'll come back over to Anne.
I wanted to ask you about the implications locally especially in terms of how Amazon affects the state's ability to collect sales tax. That's one of the benefits that they've had that I think people haven't been aware of nationwide, and I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. It's a great question, because I think one of the things that's very important, I think, to know about Amazon is that from the very beginning, so Jeff Bezos is the founder and CEO, and from the very beginning, back when he started the company in 1995, he made government favoritism a core part of his strategy with Amazon. I mean, it's built into how that company has grown, and very strategically directed on his part. So the first example of that is that instead of locating in California, which would be the obvious choice if you're starting a tech company in 1995, where all the talent is, he located in Washington State, and because he said at the time that would limit Amazon's exposure to having to collect sales tax in a big populous state like California. They wanted to be in a small population state. And for many years, they very strategically put their warehouses only in sort of select locations, all designed around avoiding having to collect sales tax in most states. Sales tax is a huge competitive advantage, and we know from Amazon's behavior that it drove a lot of sales to their site. People would say, maybe go shop in a local store, figure out what they want, and then buy it online so they could get out of the 5 or 8 or 6 or 10% price advantage. Over time, states started to go after Amazon. There were a lot of arguments about this in Congress. Amazon fought tooth and nail really up until just 2 or 3 years ago. And at that point, they realized that they were going to, for their strategy, they were going to need to have warehouses everywhere. And they were just eventually going to trigger sales tax requirements in every state. So they negotiated some deals to delay that as much as possible, but they finally gave in, and they now collect sales tax everywhere, including here in Vermont. However, there's a couple of wrinkles, if you will, to that story. One is that they don't collect sales tax for the third-party sales on their site, which is a pretty substantial portion of the sales. They could easily, it's not a problem. But what they've done is they put state governments, Vermont, Massachusetts, others, in this position of like, well, if we want to get this sales tax revenue that we're owed, if we want to have a level playing field with Amazon's platform, we're going to have to go after literally hundreds of thousands of sellers, some 10% of which are located in China. How do you enforce that? There is no way, really. One state has stepped out and been aggressive on this, which is South Carolina. So they're actually suing Amazon in court and saying you're responsible for collecting these sales taxes. So that is one thing that Vermont could do, is they could join South Carolina in that suit. The other wrinkle to that story is that as Amazon very cleverly, as they decided, well, we're going to have to collect sales tax, we just got to give up that advantage, they realized that there was an option to get another advantage, which is that they began to hire people who had worked in city economic development field. And those people were expert at going to cities and saying, we're going to build a warehouse here. We need a big tax incentive. We need a huge tax subsidy. Amazon has now picked up subsidies on more than half of the warehouses it's built since 2005. And the total value of those subsidies is now up to about $1.2 billion. And all these local governments handing out money. If you're a small business and you go to the town council and say, I want to open a second location, can I have a $100,000 tax break, or can you give me some free land? Right, that's not going to happen. But yet cities are giving out all of this money to Amazon. And they have now parlayed this with the HQ2. Have any of you been reading about this? Amazon's going to have a second headquarters. They've outgrown Seattle. So they've set off a bidding war. 200 cities across the country have entered into this bidding war. So far, the leading bid comes from Newark, New Jersey, which has assembled a combination of local and state subsidies. The deal is valued at $7 billion, which is $2 billion more than Amazon says this corporate headquarters is going to cost them to develop. Oh my God. But I think the even more valuable thing about what Amazon did with this HQ2, as it's been called, auction for its headquarters, is that they basically got local elected officials across the country you know, conservatives, progressives, Democrats, Republicans, all stripes, by bidding on this, to signal to their constituents that Amazon's growth, further growth and control, is something to be fervently wished for. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, how valuable is that? There are all these videos you can watch online of the mayor of Washington, D.C., very progressive mayor, you know, basically groveling for Amazon to put their headquarters there. You know, what kind of signal does that send about the economy? So, yes, sales tax is the tip of a bigger iceberg. Fortunately, Vermont is not a place that tends to give out subsidies to those really big companies. And the sales tax issue, I would encourage you to get, you know, to sort of push the state to get involved with what South Carolina is doing.
Thank you. How does Amazon stack up next to Google and Facebook?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, Google controls search, and Facebook increasingly controls news, because 75% of all the news traffic now either goes through Google or through Facebook. Mm-hmm. I mean, as you probably know in a much more detailed way than I do, what that enables those platforms to do is to get a lot of the advertising revenue that really should be supporting the news gathering that's generating the eyeballs in the first place. So in that way, those companies are platforms that other companies depend on. So, you know, you need your business to show up in Google search ranking, you need your news to show up in Google News, I mean, there are all kinds of other ways in which entities depend on Google, and it can manipulate those rankings in ways that disadvantage some providers and not others. Facebook is a similar kind of problem, and so there is now more and more of a conversation around what people are calling platform monopolies. So this idea that you've got these platforms, Amazon in the case of commerce, Facebook and Google in the case of information, news, search, and so on, that are kind of like the gatekeepers. They're like the modern day railroads, you know, of our economy and of our intellectual life as well, our public life, our relationships. So there's a lot of discussion, and in fact, there's going to be a hearing probably right at the beginning of December with Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee and the Progressive Caucus. They're doing a hearing on platform power. So it is a growing conversation. How do we regulate this? How do we ensure that these platforms are accountable and fair dealing, given the enormous power that they have, you know, whether it's to influence elections or to decide, you know, which products actually have a chance of making it.
Why isn't there a boycott movement against Amazon?
I think it's boycotts very rarely work. I mean, there are only some times, and I think when you can look back in history and say, well, there was a boycott that actually worked. It's very tough, and it's tough in our modern world where, you know, there are lots of evidence of things that we should boycott, I guess you could say, and so it's hard to figure out how to harness enough consumer power in that way. And I think it speaks to something, you mentioned this TED talk, TEDx talk, I should say, that I gave, which you can watch online. And what the theme of that talk was it was called Why We Can't Shop Our Way to a Better Economy. And it was about, you know, I'm someone who's been involved in the buy local movement for a long time, and I very much believe in that, because people start organizing locally and talking about why local business matters and local economy matters. It generates all kinds of benefits, and so I'm very much in favor of that. But I think if we expect our actions as consumers to actually change what's going on, we're making a big mistake about the nature of the problem that we're up against. Because really the ways in which policy structures the economy, the ways in which you can have predatory companies that can use their market power to eliminate competition, the ways in which we give these big subsidies to some businesses or not others. I mean, one example, the farm bill, you know, we spend zillions of dollars on subsidizing farms, but something like 85% of those dollars go to the top 10% of farms who are growing commodity crops, right? That's a policy decision. And we can have a local food movement, but we're like making tiny change compared to this big thing, right? I think that what happened, the idea of us as consumers mean, that's a 20th century idea that was invented by big companies. And it was invented in part to take away our actual power, which is when we're wearing the citizen hat, right? Mm-hmm. That's where our power lies. And I think, so I think when we approach this, we have to think about it in terms of policy. And we have to recognize that we have to change, we have to use our power as citizens to take away Amazon's power and to make it operate within a set of democratic values as opposed to it deciding what the values are.
So what would those policies be?
Yeah.
How would you bring enforcement back of antitrust? What would that look like?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, there's been this sort of philosophical change, if you will, that's infected how we think about antitrust. So I think part of what we need to do is bring, is to again change the framework in which economists and lawyers and enforcers think about what the purpose of antitrust is. What happened in the 1980s is that antitrust became narrowly focused on short-term consumer prices. So it didn't really matter how much power you amassed or how many small competitors you pushed out. If you could show that at least in the short term you were making lower prices, they don't care. It didn't used to be that way. We used to think about antitrust not in terms of price outcomes. We didn't measure antitrust so much in terms of price. The way we used to do it, and this was through the 1930s all the way through to the 1980s, a very prosperous time in the American economy, I might add. The way that we did antitrust in those years is that we looked at market structure. We said, well, a market that's going to work best overall, an industry that's going to work best, is when there are lots of different players and there's plenty of room. We're seeing new companies come in. We've got small companies and big companies. That was the idea, that you'd have a diversity. And if we looked at a market and said it's not structured in that diverse way, we're not seeing new entry, we would block mergers. We didn't have to do these price studies. It was like we see a situation in which we can just tell from this mix, this isn't really going to be competitive and good for consumers over time. And we also used to consider much more the impacts on workers and communities. It used to be that if two companies wanted to merge and it was you were going to lose a corporate headquarters in a community, that was a mark against the merger. And it might still go through when they balanced out the positives and the negatives, but the idea that Cleveland would lose this company that was headquartered there was considered something of a loss, because there was this idea that we wanted to disperse power, that we wanted every place to have some anchor of its own in the economy. So part of it is bringing that philosophy back. And then more specifically with regard to Amazon, there are a couple of things. One is that I think we need to separate Amazon as a retailer and manufacturer from Amazon as a platform. And we've broken up companies in the past. It's something that we have the power to do. But that would remove a lot of the conflict of interest that inherently exists. And the platform would have to become more responsive to a mix of sellers. The other thing that I think we need to do is that we need to make the platform a common carrier. And this is what we did with railroads. Because back 100 years ago, when the railroads first came along, you had Vanderbilt and these other industrialists who gained control of those rails, and they would use their control to privilege their own goods in the industries they were in and make it harder for their competitors, or more expensive for their competitors to get to market. Well, that's what Amazon is doing. And how we responded 100 years ago is we said, well, you're a common carrier. You have to treat all comers equally, and there's fairness and accountability in the rules because you control this infrastructure that's so important. We now face this in a different context, but it's very much the same thing. And then just the last two things I'll say on the policy front is we have a lot of tools at the state level that are also antitrust tools. They've been sort of dormant. I think there's a very interesting avenue to explore in terms of having conversations with state attorney general about some of these issues. You have many M-I-N-I, antitrust laws at the state level that mirror the federal laws and in some cases are stronger. So that's worth looking at. We need to look at this issue of corporate subsidies in a big way. Cities give away $70 billion every year in corporate subsidies. Big companies are the primary recipients. How about a federal law that says sure, you can take a subsidy as a company, but there's going to be a 100% tax on every dollar you get from a local government. I mean, local governments ought to support this, because right now, they're like, well, I can't, lose this because some other place is going to get it. They're like in this terrible position. So let's remove that. Mm-hmm. And then at the community level, and we can talk about this more, but I think there's a lot that communities need to do in terms of really being shepherds and stewards of a local economy. And what is it that we do at the local level to make the place where we live more resilient? And there are a lot of tools that local governments have to do that.
I was talking to a manufacturer last week who said that they're dealing with a lot of counterfeiting through Amazon. Mm. And they have a very, they have a product that's difficult to produce, it's expensive, and it does a specific thing. Mm. And Amazon is selling an inferior product that doesn't, they say that they're preventing ballistics from harming people through this eyewear, but in truth it's not actually effective that way. So how common is counterfeiting on Amazon, do you know?
Yeah, so you've got a situation where people are buying this eyewear.
Right.
They assume they're getting it from the reputable company, but they're really getting a counterfeit. They
Correct.
Don't realize that, and they complain to the reputable company.
That's right.
Very common. Counterfeiting is very common on Amazon's platform. And you would think, initially your first reaction might be, well, why doesn't Amazon police that? Mm-hmm. Because it turns out that actually gives them power. So part of the reason that Amazon likes to be all these different things, it likes to be a retailer and a manufacturer and a platform for other sellers and so on, is that it can kind of toggle between those things in ways that amplify its power. So I'll give you an example of that. Last year, Birkenstock, the shoemaker, struggling for years with counterfeit Birkenstocks on Amazon's platform, sold by third-party sellers. Amazon could police that, but Amazon said to them, yeah, we're happy to police that, but only if you do what we want. And what we want is access to your full line. So companies like Birkenstock, this is common among manufacturers, they sell their top stuff to the big retailers, but then they reserve some of the niche products and the kind of, the full range for the independent brick and mortar stores. So those stores that are providing all that extra service, that do the sizing right, that take the shoes back, that help market the Birkenstock brand through their, signage and everything. They provide all that benefit to Birkenstock, and Birkenstock in exchange says, we have a part of our line that only you will get. A lot of companies do this. And Amazon said, well, yeah, we can take care of your counterfeiting problem. We'll stop these third-party sellers. We know how to do that. But only if we can sell everything and thus eat the business of all these independent retailers. The reason we know about that story, and a lot of these stories don't ever get told for obvious reasons, the reason we know that is that Birkenstock actually stood up. Mm-hmm. And they said no. Mm-hmm. And they warned customers. They said, you'll still be able to find what you think are Birkenstocks on Amazon, but be warned, they may not be. And we are going to double down our partnership with the independent stores. They're an unusual case in the sense that they have a tremendous brand connection to their customer, and they're also a global company, so they, based in Germany, right? So they, have business elsewhere. A lot of other manufacturers have not felt that they've been so empowered, and one example is Nike. So Nike earlier this year said, fine, we'll give in. We've got to get rid of the counterfeits, and Amazon, you can have everything we produce. So, yeah.
Boy, I think I could probably ask questions all night. I do have more. One is, so is retail going to end as we know it in the next couple of years, or what?
So, this is good, because as I said, I do want to alarm people about Amazon, and I hope that you will go out and share and talk about this information, because I think it is truly alarming. But that said, we've seen a lot of headlines about the retail apocalypse and stuff, and the malls that are closing, and the stores that are going dark and everything. What's interesting is that we just actually did this survey that we're publishing tomorrow. We surveyed about 850 or so independent retailers nationally. And what we found is that, yeah, they're all being affected by Amazon, but they have these strengths. And I mentioned this earlier. They say, personal service, connection to community, essentially there are things, their expertise, the fact that you can come into this store and talk to a bookseller and discover a book that you didn't know about that you wanted to read, things that don't tend to happen on Amazon or even at a chain. So there are ways in which the independents are a bit more resilient in the face of this sort of retail apocalypse, so-called, that's out there. People are still going to buy stuff in stores, and in fact we're seeing Amazon try to figure out how to get into physical retail. But there are things that local retailers can do that really excel. We're seeing retailers across the country who are really doubling down on those connections to community, that expertise, that service that you can't get anywhere else. And I do think that there is something in our kind of socially disconnected and a little bit, at sea moment as people. You see these studies about loneliness. Loneliness is apparently worse for you than smoking cigarettes, and it afflicts a lot of folks in America. I do think that there's a way in which we are becoming more skeptical of big tech and starting to remember that there are real values in place and running into your neighbor at the bakery and actually having a bookstore that knows what you read and can make the right recommendation, and just not having your whole life mediated through the phone. So, if I were, a community, I would really be looking at how can I strengthen these local businesses, because I know that that's the way to build a more resilient economy, and how do I communicate with people. So I don't think brick and mortar retail is dead. I think it's going to be a tricky path, but my money's on the independents over, say, the chains when it comes to who's going to make it.
Yes, we'll take some questions now. Yes, so the question is, has anyone quantified how much the state of Vermont loses in sales tax? And I can answer that question. It's about $30 million a year. Has Jeff Bezos called? And if not, is he going to call soon?
Yeah, I'm waiting for that call.
Actually, it's sort of a semi-serious question too.
Yeah, no, I see the point you're getting at. It is interesting because they've really ramped up their PR just in the last year or so, and we've definitely seen them. So we did this big report called Amazon Stranglehold that came out last November, and it's been featured in a lot of, it's been in the New York Times and all sorts of places. And we did a lot of analysis that was fresh, and we also synthesized some reporting, and we did a lot of interviews. It's I think a really good piece of work and very readable. So not long after that, we started seeing one of the analysis. We did some analysis about job impacts on retail workers, and also about Amazon's wages, and we started to see alternate information come out some months later, sort of contesting those findings through some, I as an analyst would say, some sort of sleight of hand with federal data. So we've seen that. We've seen Amazon really step up. They've done these job fairs. I think one of the things they're most scared about is, because they know politicians, jobs. I think they're most scared about the realities of how little labor they use relative to the businesses they're putting out. And of course they're aiming to use even less, because they're automating and developing robotics and AI, and they'd like to have sort of nobody in the warehouses if they could. And I think they feel vulnerable about that, and so they've been hosting these job fairs, and because they're growing, they're hiring, and so they're able to sort of mask that reality. And I think the job fairs have gotten it's easy press coverage, so it's been a lot of news, and just kind of works on that meta level of oh, we're creating jobs. So we've seen that kind of response. I know they do a lot of PR work, and including at local newspapers, where they're really pitching stories on things like stories of a local business that's doing well as a seller on Amazon's platform, and you can find those stories, but it doesn't change the dynamics. So yeah, they're out there. They're also lobbying a lot and spending a lot in Washington.
We've received a number of those press releases from people who are trying to pitch us stories about local businesses, actually. Mm-hmm. I treat it like spam.
Yeah, and I think there's a kind of a related and parallel thing, which is that millennials are starting new businesses at a much lower rate than earlier generations did at their same age. And that's not really that they don't want to necessarily, it's that they're loaded down with debt. It's been a difficult economy. We don't have community banks making loans anymore. I mean, a lot of the factors that are contributing to this drop that I mentioned in new business formation have hit this young generation really hard. And I think part of how we might think about this problem is, how do we get millennials into entrepreneurship? How do we create opportunities for them? Because I think that's part of solving that. And I think they would naturally, and we see this some, I think they would naturally be able to, that they could use some of that digital savviness in ways that would begin to sort of marry the online and the offline in effective, sort of community-based stores that also engage people digitally. So I think there's an opportunity there, and I also think that in an odd way, I'm like Gen X, and I feel like we're in some ways like the drink the Kool-Aid with tech generation, sort of. It was like we sort of didn't know better, and in a way, I feel like at least with some of the millennials I know, it's as though, having grown up with it, they have more of an understanding of its downsides in a way. Maybe that's not broadly true. Maybe my sample size is too small to make those kinds of things, but I hold out hope for them. But I do think we need to think about their opportunities, and I feel like they're this untapped resource in terms of repopulating our communities with businesses.
He said, when I think about communities, I think about the idea of wealth and the multiplier effect and how that contributes to the health of a community. And are we essentially losing money from our communities? Is it sort of leaching out? And is it a torrent? What was the last part?
Just how quickly is that happening?
How quickly is that happening?
How is it projected to continue if something doesn't change?
And how is it projected to continue if something doesn't change?
Yeah. It's a great comment and issue to raise. There are studies about this, and you can find some of them on our website. We have a page called Key Studies that has these kinds of studies and a number of the other sociological research and so on that I mentioned briefly. So it varies depending on the type of business, and it can vary quite a bit, but just as a kind of thumbnail average, if you will, an independent business, typically about 45 cents of every dollar that's spent in an independent business is recirculated in the local economy. It goes to pay the wages of the people who work there. It goes to buy goods and services. If you get your printing done locally, or you hire a web developer, you hire a graphic designer, or you bank at the local bank, whatever it may be. Pay rent to a local landlord. So as I said, it varies by the type of store, but 45 cents of a dollar is about common, typical. When you get to, say, a Walmart, it's about 15 cents. It's really mostly just the wages for the people who work there, electricity. There's not too much. They don't need the local goods and services. When you get to Amazon, in the case of a community like this, maybe there's a fraction of a cent that goes to pay the driver that brought the package to your door, but you're sort of hard-pressed to find any of the dollar that stays locally. Some of it may come back in the sense that, possibly a national company does some sort of service that they get from Vermont, or some seller on the Amazon platform. So it's not complete, but that gives you at least a broad sense of how that works. Economists often say, well, but all the money's in the economy and so on. It's all still there, even if it's moving around somewhere else. And, yeah, maybe. But, as I sort of talked about, I think that there is a lot to be said for the idea of having economic capacity anchored locally, of having some measure of ownership of your economy held locally, having some dollars recirculate. And we know things, when Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, the neighborhoods that had local businesses, came back so much more quickly than the neighborhoods that didn't. We know that places that encounter problems when they have these sort of the resources that local business owners bring to bear, and that kind of sense of like being able to direct your own future in some ways, those communities solve problems better. There's the sociological research on this. They call it collective efficacy. That if you live in a community that's got this sense of connection, that has economic resources locally, people are much better able to solve problems, and they are connected to one another in ways that are much stronger. This research goes back to the 1940s. There's been recent studies that have shown this as well, but some of the earliest research is really fascinating to read, because these case studies of agribusiness dominated communities versus places that have a lot of small farms. They're very different kind of results.
I think the question is that why aren't we working together to address this problem, states in particular?
Yeah, it's a great. I mean, I think you allude to a lot of potential there, right? And we, as our organization, we do play a bit of a role in terms of helping to spread good ideas. So we publish a lot of innovative things that cities are doing to strengthen their local economies or their local businesses. And then those ideas get picked up and some other community does their own variation on it, and then we share that out. And so we play a bit of a transmitting role. We do things like this coming weekend I'll be speaking at the National League of Cities Conference, so I'll have a nice audience of city officials and mayors and so on to talk about strategies that cities can use. There are a lot of challenges that local governments can begin to address that would help take some of the pressure off small businesses. In a lot of places we're seeing sharply rising rents, for example, that are coming with property values. So we did a report last year on ways that cities and communities are addressing that, for example. We've done a lot of work on planning and zoning issues, which are really important, obviously, to local businesses. And so anyway, and then I could talk about other things, but we do try to spread those things. There's some degree of networks out there, but I don't think it's nearly built up enough as it should be. The other thing that I think is missing, or I think could be, I guess I should say, is not missing, but could be stronger, is that small business owners need more of a voice in the process and need more of a voice at the policy level. And there are groups like the American Booksellers Association, which are very active, and there are other groups like that, but there just needs to be more of that. We did create a network called Advocates for Independent Business, which is about 10 or 11 associations that represent independent businesses, and we've had some small victories. We helped to get a federal rule change that enables credit unions to do more small business lending than they used to be able to do. We've worked a lot on the sales tax issue at the federal level, though not, unfortunately, without success. And we've been submitting letters to members of Congress around the antitrust issues and have met with the top staffers for the top people on the Senate Antitrust Committee and so on. So we are doing that, though. It's got to be a bigger and a broader thing, given sort of the powers that be to move stuff out. But I think that's a really good point about what the opportunity is.
Does the Amazon family control Seattle, and is the same thing going to happen elsewhere if Amazon sets up shop in Boston or one of the 200 cities that are frantically competing for their attentions?
I mean, I'm glad to live in a place that's too small to be in the running, because there are some really beautifully written commentaries that have come out from people who live in Seattle, and I'm sorry I can't remember the writers' names. There was a planner who wrote a piece for Reuters that I really recommend. It happens to be his background is in planning, lives in Seattle, and has talked about what that company, the impact it's had. Housing prices, the median home price in Seattle now is $730,000. And the unsheltered homeless population has risen dramatically as a result. So there's a lot of ways in which people feel like the place that they lived is no longer as a result. So you know, I would be deeply heartbroken if one of my favorite cities, I lived in Minneapolis for 10 years, so I'm like, fingers crossed it's not there. Boston's so close that I worry about that too. You know, or you think about a place like Austin, which has been talked about, and how iconic Austin is. So yeah, I find it unsettling as well.
The Washington Post was purchased by Jeff Bezos a year and a half ago, I think. What implication does that have for the long term for the media, that particular media company, and democracy at large?
Yeah. Have you followed stuff at the Post? I mean, I'm curious what you think.
Well, I mean, he's poured a lot of money into the Post, and they've hired a lot of reporters, and that's never a bad thing. I mean, my impression is that he's given them a fair amount of independence. But you know, I think Donald Trump tends to take some of what the Post says a little personally. So, you know, and I'm not sure he has a great relationship with Bezos, but yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see what you think. I mean,
yeah, I mean, I have the same assessment, which is that he has invested a lot in the Post, and they have done some really good reporting in the last year. And we do have a history, you know, of very rich people having newspapers as a kind of, I don't want to say a pet project exactly, but, you know, being patrons of newspapers.
that's right.
So it is part of some of the great papers of the past have been under that sort of structure. So I'm mindful of all of those things. You know, in terms of their coverage of Amazon, they have actually done a couple of very good pieces. They did a nice profile of a colleague of mine who works in an organization called the Open Markets Institute, and she's written a really wonderful law review article called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox. And one of the Post writers did a beautiful, lengthy profile of her and the nature of her argument. And so, you know, if we continue to see that kind of reporting, then I'll sort of live with it and hope that we have enough competition elsewhere and other coverage. But it is, you know, it's certainly notable that the paper he chose is in the nation's capital. He also bought the largest house in Washington, D.C. There's a mansion that Bezos now owns. It's been operated as some kind of museum for years. It's enormous, but he now owns it and apparently is going to have it be a second residence or fourth residence, I don't know. And there is speculation that the headquarters, the second headquarters, could go to a place like Baltimore, probably not DC, but could go within the orbit of DC. So they now spend more on lobbying than Apple, than Walmart, you know, so they have a lot of K Street firms on their payroll. So they're clearly, you know, clearly know that matters, what happens there.
What is the fixation on price? We all push the button, we all, you know, buy things through Amazon. Why do we do that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. I do think there is a sort of fixation on price that blinds us to value. And there are a lot of things, this is an odd example, but I've started buying these socks that are made. I understand you actually have a sock maker here in Vermont.
We do. We just missed the big sock sale last weekend.
I know, and someone was telling me this, and I was like, damn.
Oh, it is darn tough. Cabot Hosiery in Northfield. My husband and I spent, oh yeah, there you go. You can buy them right here.
Well, there's a local retailer that's in Portland that sells socks made by this sock company in, I think it's Alabama, somewhere in the South. They're fantastic. They last forever. Yeah. So you pay more, but not that much more, and then you have something that lasts forever. There's a lot of ways in which I don't think we're very good, sort of our lizard brain or whatever, at calculating value. And that's part of the conversation that we need to have, and that I think many independent business owners are becoming more adept at having with their customers and sort of connecting dots. I mean, it's also partly because we're so busy. And I actually think Amazon's more powerful proposition to people is not the price one, it's the convenience one. And it's becoming more so as society bifurcates into the haves and the have-nots, and we don't have so many people in the middle anymore. They're really going after the folks in the more affluent, the professional. It's the busy professional, have kids, work too much, and just have no time and need to, tell my Echo to order stuff and have it, brought with the new key system so I don't even have to be at home when it's delivered. That's the thing that they're selling. And I, as someone who's, both my husband and I work in a lot of hours, I get it. I really get it. And that's, I think, where the opportunity is in terms of thinking about how, what is the mix of businesses in a community center? How can we make it possible? And this is true where I live, and I hope remains that way, is that I can run a lot of errands in a small space, a small area. I can go to the bookstore, I can go to several different local grocery stores, I can go to the bank, there's a pharmacy, on and on and on. So I can very efficiently run those errands, and I've built relationships with the local businesses in my community where I can do things like I did once with a toy store last year, where I called them and I said, I am on the way to the birthday party for my niece. I don't know what to get, here's how old she is, and I need it wrapped. And I did a drive-by, and it couldn't have been more convenient. I didn't spend time browsing on some website trying to find something. So I wonder if there are ways in which we can begin to engage people in thinking about alternative ways of thinking about convenience. But I will just to wrap things up, say that I think your question also harkens back to the point I was trying to make about the fact that when we're wearing our consumer mindset, when we're wearing that hat and in that framework, we don't necessarily make decisions that are in our long-term best interests. Mm-hmm. And when we're wearing our citizen hat, things begin to shift. The sales tax question, what this means for jobs, all these other things. And so I also think there's a kind of social or cultural sort of call to action and a way that we need to engage. Stop referring to one another as consumers. When you see news media referring to us as consumers as though that's our role in the economy, we need to push back against that, because it's just a much more powerful position to think, well, I'm a citizen, I'm a steward of this state. What kind of future do I want to leave for the next generations? I think that really changes the decision-making process and gets us to the policy questions that we need to be addressing. So, thank you.
Thank you all.